Now that you understand how we are socialized into our identities, I'd like to introduce you to a few related concepts. First is the idea of social identity development. We all start out with our personal internal identity, the things that make us unique. As we're exposed to more people, we begin to develop a social identity. This starts with social categorization, noticing that men and women dress and behave differently, that some people have skin of different color than yours, that some people speak a different language, and so on. This is a neutral process of observation. There's no value assigned to these categorizations. Once we start to understand that there are categories of difference, we start to understand that there are distinct types of social groups, and even subgroups. Almost immediately, we try to understand where we fit among these groups. This leads to a distinction between the traits of the in-group, that is, the group to which you belong, and the traits of the out-group, the group where you don't belong. We then compare the traits of our own group to that of other groups and put a positive value on in-group traits and a negative value on out-group traits. The second concept I'd like to introduce you to is the cycle of socialization. This is another way of thinking about how we are socialized and how those ideas are reinforced by others. We start with no real concept of social identities, again, only some sense of our individual identity. Our first socialization begins with our early interactions, our parents and relatives, teachers, basically people we trust who help shape our values and expectations. As our world expands, those values and expectations are reinforced and challenged by the institutions we interact with and the media we consume. Behaviors that are approved of, both by the people we trust and wider institutions, are praised and rewarded. Behaviors that are not considered acceptable for your social identities are punished, either formally, such as detention or being grounded, or informally, through teasing and derision. That reinforcement affects our actions. We have a choice to accept the boundaries of our social identities, or to push against those boundaries. Those who do not accept the boundaries of their expected social identities tend to be ostracized, though, and barriers are put up to make interacting with social institutions more difficult. The goal is to push people back within the boundaries of their social identities, so that they can pass those along to others, and thus perpetuate the continuation of social hierarchies. Finally, a few terms to define. I'm sure many people have heard the term privilege before, and it's a term that's often weaponized and can trigger some really negative feelings. Put simply, though, privilege is merely a set of unearned benefits given to those with a specific social identity. It is the result of living in a society with a social hierarchy. Another term that's fairly common is unconscious or implicit bias. These are ways in which our attitudes towards those who are part of an outgroup, either an outgroup in relation to yourself or an outgroup in relation to the dominant identity, affect our understanding and actions. These are the result of our socialization, and we are not consciously aware of them. In fact, it is entirely possible, even likely, that you have unconscious biases that do not match your conscious beliefs. Lastly, there's the concept of in-group bias. This is a term from psychology that reflects our natural tendency to view those who are like ourselves more positively, and those who are unlike ourselves negatively. Now, I want you to think for a minute about what happens when we have a natural tendency towards favoring those like ourselves, and then a system of social hierarchy where some identities have more access to financial, social, and political power. Those with more power are more likely to treat the people like themselves better, and the people less like themselves less well. Because they have power, those tendencies become codified into rules, social norms, and laws. This is what is meant by social oppression. Here we have a visual representation of the matrix of oppression, which is designed by Patricia Collins, one of the editors of our textbook. It's very similar to the dominant model identity map, right? What this chart is showing us is that the closer one exists to the dominant or privileged social identity, the further you are from the oppression linked to that identity category. Thus, middle-class people are less likely to experience the barriers created by classism than poor people. Young adults are less likely to experience ageism than children or the elderly. Biracial and lighter-skinned racial minorities are less likely to experience racism than darker-skinned racial minorities. Pause here for a moment and study the chart to make sure you have a good understanding of the various oppressions shown here. We're going to spend most of the first half of the semester digging into what all of these mean. There are two major types of oppression. The first of these is individual oppression. This is when a person consciously believes a dominant identity is superior to a marginalized identity. While these attitudes are usually due to socialization, they can be changed. Some examples. That guy is a pussy. Pussy refers to female genitalia, commonly associated with the feminine. Because the social hierarchy tells us that men are tough and women are soft, associating a man with the feminine is implying that he is soft and therefore weak, and by extension, anything feminine is weak. Black people are thugs. Thug is a term used to denote someone of low intelligence, who is prone to violence. Because the social hierarchy pushes the notion that black people are not as smart as white people and are more violent than white people, the use of the term thug falls into dominant narrative stereotypes. Poor people are too dumb to save their money. Social hierarchy likes to frame class as a matter of intelligence and hard work, rather than luck and the hoarding of financial power. This statement reflects that stereotype by suggesting it's a lack of intelligence that keeps poor people poor. That movie was lame. Lame is a term used to refer to a physical disability that restricts movement. In this phrase, lame is used as a way to describe something the person didn't like. This equates physical disability with something bad and reinforces the notion that those with physical disabilities are inferior. Note, in some cases, people have used the term gay in the same way, and it really has the same connotation. It's a reflection that by using gay to equal something bad, that gay people are bad. Now, pause for a minute. Do you feel offended by some of these statements? Or the explanations? Do you feel defensive? What facets of your identity might explain why you feel offended or defensive? When those biases and stereotypes are incorporated into the structures and processes of institutions, we refer to this as systemic or institutional oppression. Systemic oppression can be the result of either conscious or unconscious prejudice towards marginalized groups, or it can be the failure of those with dominant identities, and therefore power, to understand and take into account the needs of those with marginalized identities. Systemic oppression is particularly difficult to recognize. Often the specific rules and practices appear neutral, particularly to those who create them. It is only when we look at broader patterns can we see how cumulatively people with dominant identities usually end up with more resources and access than those with marginalized identities. Because those advantages and barriers are not obvious to those in charge, they're very difficult to change. We'll discuss what creates change later in the semester when we talk about activism. Also, systemic oppression does not necessarily involve someone within that system being overtly biased, or any sort of individual prejudice. It's very possible to consciously be against discrimination and still be part of systems that are biased. Some examples of how systemic oppression shows up in patterns. We know from other research that white and black people consume cannabis at about the same rate. However, black people are almost 4 times as likely to be arrested for cannabis possession, and in some locations, black people are more than 10 times as likely to be arrested as white people. Once arrested, black people are more than twice as likely to be convicted and sent to prison than white people. At the same time, the legal cannabis industry is predominantly white. in part because in many places, felons cannot participate in a cannabis business. High-level government positions are still mostly held by older white men. For example, currently 10 U.S. senators are not white, 10% of the entire Senate. By contrast, almost a quarter of the United States is not white. There are currently 26 women senators, while women make up over 50% of the U.S. population. This is a result of a number of effects, including racism and sexism towards individual candidates, and expectations as to what a good or winnable candidate looks like. In most places, schools are paid for by property taxes. Property taxes are collected by local governments and are a percentage of the worth of each house. Therefore, in neighborhoods with more expensive houses, more money will be collected for schools. In poorer neighborhoods, there's far less money collected to fund schools. This means that children whose parents are wealthier and live in more expensive houses will have access to better funded and better resourced schools. People with disabilities have a higher rate of unemployment, poverty, and homelessness. The reasons for this are wide-ranging, from difficulty securing transportation, inability to navigate some public spaces, lack of compliance with ADA regulations regarding accessibility, and stereotypes regarding the intelligence of people with disabilities. The result is that it's far more difficult for those with disabilities to access helpful resources and remain employed. This creates a domino effect that leads to poverty and homelessness. All of these show the patterns of systemic racism, sexism, classism, and ableism. In very few cases can you point at a single reason or rule that is creating these disparities, yet they still exist. That's the hallmark of systemic oppression. Finally, I want to introduce you to the concept of intersectionality. Some of you may have run across this term before, particularly online. The basic concept of intersectionality is that we experience all of our identities simultaneously, and the way our marginalized identities interact, the intersections of identity, create unique types of discrimination. But rather than me explaining it, I'd like you to hear it from Kimberly Crenshaw herself. Ms. Crenshaw is a law professor at both UCLA and Columbia University, and is one of the founders of the school of thought known as critical race theory. She developed the concept of intersectionality. The next video you'll watch is her TED Talk explaining the concept. And just a note, her talk can be a little intense and might bring up some feelings of anger or defensiveness. Prepare yourself before you watch it, and try to keep an open mind to her points. Good luck, and I will see you in the discussion forums.